I get the icon in cornflower blue?
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 19 of Can I Get That Software in Blue? I'm one of your hosts, Chad Tindel. Along with me is my co-host, a tech sales expert who lives in the desert, the open source radical currently on sabbatical, Steve Mayzak, everybody.
Thanks, Chad. How's it going?
It's good. We're here in a professional podcast studio. We've never done this in a professional podcast studio before. Usually we're all remote, and I think this is kind of fun. I feel like we're growing up a little bit. We got the logo here in the background. We got 3 cameras going. It's pretty fun.
Very cool.
I wish you were here with us, though. You need to come to New York next time we do this.
Yeah. Next time we do this studio thing, I'm going to fly over.
Definitely. Fly the jet. You got to fuel your own jet. What do you have, a G3, G4,
Yeah, right.
something like that?
Yeah, the Lego version.
You know, we have this sort of long-running bit here about LaCroix water, and they heard about it, and they sent me one of their new flavors. It's called Beach Plum. I haven't even tried it yet. Here, I'm going to open it up and try it here on the podcast. Emile said gas water is not good for interviews, but we got to go for it anyway. I'll just
technically it's La Croix.
Oh,
yeah, that's like when my son tries to have a croissant.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
La Croix. Here it is. Okay, beach plum. I wouldn't say that it has a strong plum flavor. Actually, it's got kind of like a rum feeling to it, although there's no alcohol in it, but that's what it reminds me of. It definitely reminds me of the beach here.
Plum is kind of a light flavor anyway, so I don't know how you would taste it.
It's not a heavy flavor. It does taste like stone fruit.
Yeah.
Here, I'll bust out my sommelier chops. It tastes like a stone fruit, hints of green apple and pear, and a finish of wet granite at the end. Okay.
There's no dirt. There's no dirt.
No dirt.
taste.
Yeah, no. This is not an earthy flavor. This is a crisp, fruity flavor. Okay.
I love that wet granite. Does that mean like in sommelier class they make you lick certain surfaces so you know what they taste like?
Literally, they brought in a granite rock and poured water on it and said, "Here, smell it."
No way.
See, yeah, absolutely.
Oh my God, that's funny.
Absolutely. All right, well, let's get serious here. We have a special guest here. He is an extraordinarily deep thinker and an expert on the topic of collective intelligence. He has a degree in applied mathematics and a Ph.D. in cognitive psychology, both from Carnegie Mellon University. And he is the managing director of Hypermind, a crowd forecasting software platform optimized for prediction and idea prioritization. He's published dozens of scholarly articles, and his most recent book, which he published in French in 2018 under the title, I'm going to say it, Super Collective. How do you say it in French?
Super collectif.
What? Super. Okay, that's okay. I'm gonna learn my
Sounds
French
much
accent
better.
here.
Yeah.
Super Collective is currently being translated to English under the title Intelligence We Trust, and hopefully will be released either the end of this year or maybe in 2023. The book is a nonfiction depiction of how markets make a prediction. When it comes to finding the statistical truth, he's like MacGyver. Dr. Emile Servan-Schreiber, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Do you know how hard it is to find a word that rhymes with Schreiber?
Well, in French, the word that kids would kid me about in school was camembert.
Yeah.
Schreiber and camembert.
Oh my God. How did I not think of camembert cheese?
Exactly. Yeah. I'd rather you not think of it.
We'll edit that out maybe. All right. Well, Emile, we're going to dive deep into your work shortly. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about your background. You come from a very prestigious family in France. Actually, when I was doing research, I Googled your name and I started reading the Wikipedia page for Emile Servan-Schreiber. I wasn't reading word by word. So I got about partway down before I realized it was actually about your grandfather, who I assume is your namesake.
Absolutely. He's squatting he's trolling me on Wikipedia.
Yes, he's squatting on your Wikipedia
Yeah.
page. We need the disambiguation for Emile Servan-Schreiber. Who would have thought that would? But he started a very famous newspaper in France. Is that right?
He started the first economic daily newspaper, like the Wall Street Journal of France.
Okay, and is it still going?
Still going. Yeah, it's called Les Echos, and I think it belongs to now some big press conglomerate from England.
Your family's not running it anymore.
No.
Okay, he wrote some books too, right?
He wrote plenty of books.
What was his area of expertise there?
He was an economic journalist, but worldwide. So he would go and meet with Mussolini and meet with the Japanese emperor and meet actually with Roosevelt.
Well, he's playing all the angles there.
Yeah. So and that was during between the First World War and the Second World War, where he would take a year and just travel the world and meet with big leaders and then write a book and say, what's going on the other half of the world.
Was he advising them?
No, he was just a reporter interviewing and then coming back and telling French people what's going on.
Okay. And then your father, Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber, was also well known. He wrote a book in the 60s called The American Challenge.
Yeah, actually before that he started the Time magazine of France, the first news magazine in France.
Really?
Called L'Express, yeah.
And was that published under Les Echos or totally separate?
It started as a weekend supplement and then quickly became its own thing.
Wow.
So eventually, the family sold Les Echos and then invested everything into L'Express and it became a huge thing.
I only know L'Express as the all-night diner in Montreal. That's where you go when you want foie gras at 3 a.m. in Montreal.
Problem with international trademark.
Your father's book, I read it maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It was republished. Paul Krugman wrote a foreword for it. I mean, looking back on it, right, he was basically saying all of these things that America is doing that are going to cause problems for Europe if Europe doesn't unite. And some of the things he was totally wrong about, but some of the things he was spot on the money about. And, this noting in the 60s, the upcoming semiconductor industry in California and the future that would have if Europe didn't get into the semiconductor business. I mean, obviously, look, here we are. We have Silicon Valley and all these huge companies coming out of America. He was totally on the money, 30, 40 years in the...
Absolutely. I remember, he started in 81 with President Mitterrand. He started what was called World Center for Computer Science and Human Resource in Paris, where all the big names in computer science in America who actually came to Paris to run this thing, which was about how do you use computers to make a difference in education, agriculture, all kinds of things where nobody at the time thought computers could make any difference. Maybe you had Steve Jobs thinking that computers could have something to say about education, but that was all. And when he talked about computers having an impact on agriculture, and that would be really important, everybody just laughed. And now you can't run a farm without all your drones and your weather forecasting and
all the machines that are out seeding the ground and sprinkling the water, it's all measured up for the Internet of Things for sure.
So predicting the future is just very difficult.
Definitely.
Right? And many people just can't see what it's going to be like.
Yeah, it was really interesting to read that book. So I'm curious, what was family life like around the dinner table? Was it, you live in this very intellectual household, all your siblings are incredibly smart, everybody's got Ph.D.s and M.D.s, and what was it like? Were you talking about politics at the table and economics, or was it like, hey, pass me the Cheerios?
No, it was more like politics and computers and world affairs. I was fascinated myself by the intelligence of my father, who was just a really smart guy. Even the president of France used to say, he has one too many piece of brain.
Too many brain cells?
Too many brain cells, yeah. He had a way of thinking about the world that was just really different. People said, he's somebody who came from the future. And I was fascinated by that. I think my desire to understand intelligence as a concept, as a mechanism, comes from trying to understand what the hell my father was talking about and how he would approach problems in a really weird way that nobody else, really original way that nobody else had used to think about the same problem. That's how I became interested in smarts in general. And because he was so smart and so much smarter than I am, I always had this modest way of thinking about my own smarts. When I came to Carnegie Mellon, I was again surrounded by super smart, genius level people like, Nobel Prize caliber. It just fed into my desire to understand what the hell is this thing, intelligence, and how do you master it?
Have you mastered it?
I haven't, but I found a way to do. I found a way to the mastery.
Well, we're going to talk about that for sure. I was wondering, clearly your dad's book was arguing for the creation of the European Union, right? He thought that European countries should band together so that they can be an economic collective powerhouse against America. And I thought that he would be listed maybe as like a founding father of the European Union or something like that. And there is a Wikipedia page for founding fathers of the EU. He wasn't on it, which I was disappointed by. But I feel like he's at least a midwife or something.
Well, he's certainly a big advocate.
Would you think he'd be happy about how things are now?
Probably not. Europe has become this huge, unwieldy affair that's been also infiltrated by people who don't share the values that people commonly think are the European value, like the Hungarian guy, and he's more of an authoritarian than a Democrat. And Trump guys love it, right?
Yeah.
So he had a big success in Florida a while back, right? Just
Sure.
last week, I think.
Sure. And of course,
So,
Boris
yeah.
Johnson and Brexit and everything else.
Yeah, so everything is going to hell.
That's a spicy take.
No, it's true.
Going to hell.
Yeah, but it's relatively easy to fix. When my father was advocating for Europe, it was like 6 nations getting together or something like that. Now it's 27. So it's completely different.
All different languages, everything.
It requires completely different organization, which hasn't been done. So it's still working, as if it was a group of 6 people around the table. And it doesn't work that way anymore.
Right? Makes sense.
Well, if you think about it too, like the way the U.S. was built and kind of founded, it was built on the idea of all these states working together, and Europe was not like that, right? So it's kind of like you're trying to apply new technology to old technology rather than rewrite it. Kind of feels like that anyway.
All right. Well, let's dive into your book. So basically the forum we're going to take today is we'll talk about your book, what collective intelligence is. Then we'll talk about the company you started and maybe the future. So your book, Intelligence We Trust, you provided us with an English translation, which hasn't been released yet. And both Steve and I read it. Fascinating book. Starting at the beginning, you talk about the fact that all of the computer processing power on the planet is roughly equivalent to about 8,000 human brains, which I couldn't like. That's unbelievable to me because we think about how many, I don't even know, hundreds of millions of computers are out there, billions of computers are out there.
Yeah, and PlayStations and smartphones, and the power of a single human brain is just amazing. One human brain is the equivalent of tens of super powerful, supercomputer from the latest generation.
And what is that measured by?
Well, the number of floating point operations per second. It's like 10 to the 18 or something.
One brain.
Yeah, number of operations per second. Plus, everything's going on in parallel. So we are very bad at doing, square root computation. But we are very good at knowing whether something is a pig or an airplane in a picture, or, knowing how to talk to each other in a nice way.
Yeah.
And entertain other people. And there's lots of stuff that computers cannot do yet, except they can do very good square roots. So, people and computers are good at very different things. But what's amazing is the sheer amount of computing power that we have. And the problem now is to organize it properly, now that we're all connected together, which is a new thing, right? When I was younger, certainly 20 years ago, nobody was connected as we are now. So now we're all connected to each other. I mean, language is not even a barrier anymore. People live longer, so you have more access to more wisdom from the older people.
Do we use it?
We're starting to learn how to organize ourselves through these computer networks in order to become smarter together.
You say in the book that really the power of collective intelligence is kind of like the density of the network.
Right.
But when I think about it, I think of social networking, and it seems like it's making us dumber, not smarter.
Right. That's because it's by design.
Well, they could have chosen to make us smarter, but they went the opposite way?
Facebook could make you smarter in a minute.
How?
By making sure that you don't only hear from people who think like you, would be one.
Okay, taking us out of the echo chamber.
Exactly. Facebook wants to keep you in the echo chamber because they get more clicks this way, right?
But if my echo chamber is other smart people, doesn't that make me smarter?
Well, the echo chamber is going to make you smarter to the extent that the people in the chamber are smart and that they are smart in a different way. So it's both the intelligence, the expertise, the depth of everyone's knowledge, and the diversity of that knowledge and different points of views that are going to be making you smarter. There's actually a theorem for that.
Emile, it feels like social media is kind of making a bunch of wise fools, right? Like they're so sure they're right when they're wrong. about many different things.
Absolutely, because they only hear from people who think exactly the same. So
That's right.
it's natural to think you're right.
Yeah, so if you believe in flat Earth theory and you find all these things telling you the Earth is flat, like you're going to get pretty convinced pretty quick, I think, even though
Exactly.
you're just ignoring like some of the basic evidence.
I mean, there's several aspects to that. So, as I said, there's a theorem. It's very important. It's called the diversity theorem. And it's actually math. It's like E equals MC squared. It's true. It's not like one of these fake management theorems, right? It's a true mathematical theorem.
It's not the Dilbert principle.
Exactly. And what it says is very important. It says the group is going to be smart to the extent that people are smart and that they think differently. So the diversity can sometimes trump knowledge or expertise. By having more people who don't really know much, but everyone knows a little bit, you can combine that to have a 360 around a problem that's complicated, that nobody can master just by themselves.
And if I remember the math from the book, it was because the people who are on the extreme ends of being wrong kind of cancel each other out, and you converge towards the right answer, right?
Exactly. You could say that the collective intelligence is about using other people's stupidity to compensate for your own.
That's a funny line.
And the more people there are in the group, and the more likely it is that somebody has exactly the same opposite biases and mistakes that you would make. So they can cancel you out.
So just so the audience knows, can you maybe define collective intelligence and lead us into that?
Well, collective intelligence is really about being smart rather than just being together, right? So lots of people hear collective intelligence and they think collective. They think it's just people getting together around the table in the same room, and then magic happens and everybody becomes smart together, right? Through consensus or whatever. But it's really about how you organize the interactions among people in order to make the group smart. That can depend on the smarts of the people. It can depend on how different point of views are present in the room and how you manage it through a process that can be face-to-face or can be organized through some computer technology online or wherever, some other platform that, first of all, extract everybody's opinion so that it is on the table and make sure that it's taken into account when you consolidate the whole thing into a group opinion. So collective intelligence is really about how to be smart as a group. And I would say that there is no intelligence in any shape or form today that we know about that is not collective. So collective intelligence is kind of weird when you think about it, because all intelligence, I would argue, is in fact based on collective, including your own brain.
Well, you mean kind of we're standing on the shoulders of giants. We already know what the people before us learned. Is that what you mean?
Well, that's one way of looking at it. But the other way is that your own brain is 80 billion little processing units working together. When you think about intelligence, you think about a single brain, but a single brain is not a single anything. It's just 80 billion things working together to make up your brain, and all the way to the two halves of your brain, the two hemispheres, who actually see the world in very different ways and process the world in very different ways. I mean, to you, it feels like there's only one you, right? But I could easily make two you by just cutting the whatever broadband there is between the two hemispheres.
People have had that surgery done.
Some people have that, and it's really bizarre.
But do they feel like two people when they do that?
I'm not sure how they feel, but you can actually talk to each part of the brain independently and have them sort of invent what the other one is thinking. So it's really bizarre.
That sounds crazy. I liked your 2x2. You kind of had a 2x2 picture showing on one dimension that data could be structured or unstructured, and on the other dimension that data could be small data or big data. And it was kind of this idea that as you move from unstructured to structured, well, humans are better at dealing with unstructured data. Computers are better at dealing with structured data. And so if you have small structured data, you maybe just need one computer. And if you have big structured data, you need a lot of computers. And when you're dealing with unstructured data, you might, if you have a little bit, you just need one mind. And if you have a lot, you might need a lot of minds to process it. And I like that way of thinking about it.
It's not really structured versus unstructured, although that's the way I put it in the book. But when you think about it, what really matters is whether computers have access to the data or not.
Well, it has to be encoded in a way that the computer can deal with it.
Yeah. So structured, that's what I mean by structured is, is it available for a computer to process? Machine readable. So now, you can have like sensors that can see the world and take some data, make it structured for a computer. But still, you can see that in elections, for example, there's lots of data about the elections. For example, the midterms coming up, that's available, right? You have polls. But then the polls are sort of the only structured data that's available for computers to work with. So you have like Nate Silver process all the polls and come up with some probabilities for what's going to be happening, who's going to have a majority in Congress. And probably 90% of what's going on is some other stuff, right, on the ground, like what your neighbors think.
What they think, because what they think is not necessarily what they say to a pollster.
Exactly, and what might happen next week, between China and Taiwan, or the FBI in Mar-a-Lago, So people can process that. People can figure out what in the environment might have an influence, whereas computers can only process the data that's already available in a database somewhere. And that gives us the advantage to take more data into account that could be important for analyzing a problem.
Is what you're really saying is that because people can have the creativity to imagine all of the different possible things that could happen, then we can process them in advance, whereas computers don't have that creativity?
Right. Computers can only process what's been made available to them. Now, it reminds me of this story about the guy looking for his keys under a lamppost, right? You remember that story? So there's a guy under a lamppost here at night, in a parking lot, and there's a cop that sees this guy and says, what's going on? He says, I'm looking for my keys under the lamppost. And the cop says, well, obviously your keys aren't there. And he says, I know, but that's where the light is, right? Data is sort of like that. People will process the data that's available, even if it's only 10% of what could be relevant to the problem they're looking at. They will come up with conclusions based on that 10% of data that's available, even though there's a whole world of data out there that is not yet available but very relevant. And human brains are very good at figuring out what data might be relevant in the environment that is not yet available for computers in the database somewhere.
You touched on it a little bit, Emile, about how like intelligence works, and in the book you mentioned this. I think it's called the Surowiki machine, and I thought that was very fascinating. Just this idea of like our brains are basically this collective intelligence, and we're kind of. Chad made a point about like where we're almost predicting things, but we're not like getting ahead of computers. It's just that we can process things so much faster, right? Like we're still doing it in real time, but our brains are basically prediction machines, like trying to evaluate all these different outcomes all at the same time. Is that right?
Your brain is definitely a prediction machine. I mean, the reason you have a brain is because you have to make predictions. And the reason you have to make predictions is because you're moving around in the environment. Plants don't have brains because they don't have to move. Basically, as soon as you have to move, you have decisions to make. Should I go left or right? Am I going to find food? Or if I go left or right, am I going to be eaten by something else if I go left or right? So your brain evolved to be a prediction machine. And for us who have been working in AI, it's interesting to see that AI started to work only quite recently when they forgot about doing problem solving and started to look at the same problems only through the angle of predictions. What should I predict based on this data? And if I don't make the right prediction, I get kicked in the head, and then I have to make another prediction that's a little bit better, and that's called machine learning. AI works because we reframed the problem as predictions only.
In the book, you talk a lot about how the human brain works and basically what we understand of it so far. There's this whole other kind of area of study about the gut brain, right? Like the microbiome in our guts and how that is potentially also guiding thoughts and actions. Like, has there been a lot of research, or are you aware of research that's trying to combine these two fields into one, like thinking about the brain and the microbiome in our gut?
Only in a peripheral way. So I think Daniel Kahneman recently came up with a new book called Noise. One of the kind of studies they look at is how you individually, you, Steve, and you, Chad, think differently before lunch or after lunch. And for you, Steve and Chad, it may not make a whole lot of difference. But if you're a judge, it starts to make a difference because you can apply a more severe sentence before lunch or after lunch.
Do judges do that?
They do, absolutely. And they do it unconsciously, just because they think differently, because the gut thing is going to interact with the brain thing in a different way. And they won't be the same judge before lunch or after lunch. It will be just a different person. And so are we. So are all of us. That's what we call in psychology the crowd within. You're not a single Chad. You're many Chads, and the Chads vary over time during the day. And that's why you think, sometimes I better sleep on it. Why? That's a way of having collective intelligence between the Chad before sleeping and the Chad after sleeping, right? And you can sort of combine the opinions of both Chads into a smarter opinion.
But all the Chads love a refreshing can of Beach Plum LaCroix.
You're gonna manifest this into existence, this sponsorship. I love
Perfectly pronounced this time.
Yeah, actually, I was listening to the Huberman Lab podcast, and he's a researcher at Stanford, and he was talking about a study where they gave people a sugary solution, but they numbed their taste buds, so they couldn't taste whether. So they gave them two solutions: one with sugar, one without, and they showed that the gut has its own nervous system components to it.
Yep.
So even if you can't taste something sweet, your gut recognizes that there's sugar in it, and it will prefer the sugary solution, even though you can't taste it.
Yep.
And the fact that the stomach has its own nervous system or part of it, that blew my mind. That really blew my mind. And it makes me realize we know so little about really the human brain still.
Well, we know so little about so many things, but that's the whole point of collective intelligence, is that it's become impossible for somebody in this day and age to master human knowledge. There's just too much of it. 300-400 years ago, you could do that.
Yeah,
there was 15 books or something. Could have read all the books and you'll be fine. You would have known everything that had to be known or was known at the time. But nowadays, it's just impossible. Even in your own field of expertise, it's impossible. And that's why you can see that even scholarly articles that used to be written by just one person, nowadays it's typical that you have 30 people co-authoring the latest article on the Google AI or something. Right?
Oh, because it takes that many people to make progress in an area now.
Absolutely. And none of them know everything that went on into writing this paper or making that discovery. I publish sometimes with 3 or 4 other authors. None of us can master completely what everybody did in that project before it gets published.
Right.
So it's just impossible.
This is totally unrelated. I just have a question for you, because I ask this question sometimes for people who are big into math. You have a degree in math. One of your degrees is in applied math. Back in the days when calculus was invented, that was groundbreaking stuff that only people like Newton and Leibniz and those guys understood.
Yep.
And now we teach it to kids in high school. Do you think 100 years from now, kids are going to be learning calculus in elementary school and some new advanced math is what they're going to learn in high school? Or
kids are learning programming at 5 years old already. And that used to be, I had to get into college before they would teach me programming, right?
Yeah, but I don't think they're learning about, Turing machines and completeness theorems and stuff.
Because that's probably pretty useless
to
do most things, right?
Right.
So I know my brother knows about P and NP, whatever. I still don't understand it. I don't care. I never had to use it. I don't need to know. I mean, that's the human collective intelligence, is that you rely on other people being specialists in their own area, and you can call upon them when you need to, and you don't have to know everything anymore. And the more connected we are, and the less we need to know about anything, really, because intelligence, and that's a definition I love about intelligence from Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist. Intelligence is not about what you know; it's about what you do when you don't know. Right? And the first thing you have to do when you don't know, which most of us have a problem doing sometimes, is asking other people, asking for advice.
Well, there's a bit of learning how to learn as well. You have to know how to go look things up and how to learn new things.
Right. And also know who to ask when you don't know.
Emile, since reading your book, I've been throwing out random quotes to my wife, especially the fact that you mentioned about, women and their inclusion in groups makes the group smarter. There's pretty good evidence to show that that's the case. So, of course, I use that to my advantage. Honey, look, I can't, I'm smarter with you than without you. Anyways, she said something this morning.
Does it work the other way, though? I mean,
I don't know.
Would she say that? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. But she said something this morning that I thought was funny. because I was reading an article from the James Webb Telescope about some new discovery, and they found some galaxy that shouldn't exist. Basically, it's like older than they ever thought they could be. And she goes, well, Einstein. She goes, how do they know it's older? And I said, well, Einstein's theory of whatever. And she goes, well, Einstein wasn't that smart. He didn't invent cell phones. Like, he didn't even know how to use a cell phone. And I just thought that was hilarious. Like, Einstein, who is someone I think is amazing, and she's like, yeah, he wasn't that smart because he didn't invent the cell phone. It's just like, okay. But it made me think about what you just said, is like Einstein and other people like that we put on these pedestals as being geniuses were probably only as good as the people they surrounded themselves with. And even though they get credit for the ideas, there's no way that it was just their idea, right?
Absolutely.
Like it's a collection of minds.
Absolutely. And my favorite example here would not be Einstein, it would be Newton, because as you said, shoulders of giants. Newton was the first guy, he was the first to admit that he was not thinking just by himself. He was thinking based on all these guys that came previously who were not his contemporaries, but people he could rely on, whose knowledge he could rely on to inform his own. Same thing for Steve Jobs, who was probably a true genius as well. And people credit for inventing, Macintosh and all these things, and then later the iPad, whatever. You have to remember that when the Macintosh was created, they had inside, and you couldn't even open the box, right? It was forbidden to open the box. But inside were engraved the signatures of everybody on the Macintosh team. And that's because Steve Jobs was always a true team leader who would surround himself with people he actually thought were smarter than him.
Well, his genius was assembling the team and propelling them forward.
Exactly. That's where we go to Surowiki, which you mentioned earlier. His great book from 20 years ago now, called The Wisdom of Crowds. It's a great title, Wisdom of Crowds. And the recipe that Surowiki lays out in the book for being smart together has just a few components to it, a few ingredients. So the first one is diversity of thought. In order to have collective intelligence, you need to have people think differently. Otherwise, you might just have one person in the room. Secondly, so people who think differently, they need to have a process that encourages them or forces them to actually say so. Because if everybody around the table thinks differently, but nobody dares say it, because it's more comfortable to conform, because the process encourages you to conform, then it's not going to be smart as well, right? So you need to have people think differently and a process in place. That's where organization matters a lot, or algorithm or process or method that is going to make people express what they think independently. And that's where also betting is a fantastic way of doing that, because if you agree, then you can't bet, right? So the betting forces you to find where you agree to disagree, which is a great way of expressing differences. And then you need just a way of aggregating the whole thing into a collective opinion, not by seeking consensus, but just by putting things together. So it could be a mathematical mean when you're trying to average estimates for some noisy measure. Or it could be a vote, if you're trying to figure out who the next leader should be. Obviously, when we come into an election, we don't expect that everybody's going to agree before the vote.
Right.
On the contrary, we have this process that encourages all these wildly opposite opinions to get expressed. And then we take a vote and we take the majority vote and say, then we move on, right? With a decision. Not consensus, but a decision.
You actually defined intelligence earlier as the ability to make predictions, which I think is not how most people think of intelligence.
Well, yeah, and Chad, to further that, what is knowing? What does it mean to actually know something?
All right, this is a philosophical trap.
Yeah, we're going deep here.
Yeah. I know.
But in a way, you're saying that intelligence is actually the ability to think probabilistically. Right, because like Steve's kind of, you don't actually really know. Predictions are always probabilistic. There's this chance that this is going to happen versus that, and so it's really, like you said, or I mean, the way I read it was really thinking in terms of probabilities is something that people should do more often.
Absolutely, and there's this great 19th century Frenchman who was a journalist at the time, also a politician, who said, basically the world is probabilistic. The world is probabilistic, right? That's what we base the insurance business on. That's what we base a lot of other things on. But we don't look at government in terms of probabilities. And really, politicians in matters of war, in matters of strategic importance should be thinking about the world probabilistically and evaluating those probabilities properly, because if you don't, then you're going to have shitty government. If you do, you're going to have high politics. And he said, governing is essentially predicting before you act, because a prediction that is not acted on is sort of wasted, and an action that is not based on a prediction is probably something very dangerous.
I didn't really learn to think probabilistically until I learned to play poker. And then I had to learn to think in probabilities. Every decision was based on a probability.
Exactly. And sometimes it's not the right decision.
No, you just try to make more right decisions than bad decisions. Or even sometimes it is the right decision and just the cards come, it doesn't go your way.
Exactly. Right. So, but the important thing is, somebody, another intellectual who actually wrote the book with Kahneman, the more recent one, called Sibony. He has this great sentence about decision making. He says, a good decision is a decision that's been well taken. What defines a good decision is not the outcome, is the way that the decision has been made.
Right.
The process that you use, which is, in your case, in poker, probabilistically looking at the cards and coming up with the best probabilities, even though a probability is just a probability.
Right.
25% may be seen like a low probability of anything, but if you had 25% chance of getting run over by a car, getting out of the studio, you would stay in the studio.
Absolutely. Because I don't like that kind of risk.
Exactly.
But do you think we should be teaching poker to kids? I think we should, specifically so they learn to think probabilistically, and that's my spicy take for the day.
I don't think you have to teach poker to get them to think probabilistically.
No, we should teach probabilities.
Right, but that's boring. Right, you have to. You want to make it. You want to make it like. Look. I mean, I took.
Yeah, you're assuming that teaching probabilities is boring.
It is, man. Who wants to sit around and learn about Poisson distributions and learning how to do linear transformations to go in and out of normal tables and things like that? No one like that's really. I know you have to, but
put it in Fortnite or Minecraft, and everyone will be smarter.
I agree. Learning about probabilities is boring. But
you don't like a good Poisson distribution? I just like saying the word.
No, but that's pretty boring. But we manipulate probabilities all the time without calling them such. We talk about chances of things happening. And that becomes much more intuitive. People have this intuition about probabilities that they use all the time to make predictions about things in their own life. And we notice that when we organize, for example, forecasting competitions on geopolitics, what happens over there, the probability of conflict between China and Taiwan, is something that people are able to put a probability on, even though they don't know much about probabilities, even though they may not know much about Taiwan and China or about history.
Well, what people? I mean, I think if you walked around Manhattan and asked, like, what probability do you think China's going to invade Taiwan and cut the U.S. out of the semiconductor industry, they're not going to have a...
Some of them will. They will have a tiny piece of the answer, a tiny feeling about it, and you will have a lot of noise. So any one individual is likely to be very wrong. But if you have 1,000 individuals, very likely they will come up with a decent probability for that kind of event.
I don't think I would trust it. And maybe that means I'm not buying into your book.
That's the whole. Yeah, that's the whole point.
Let's take another example. Infectious disease pandemic outbreaks.
Okay.
Right? So that's something where you would think there are a lot of experts in the world. The Anthony Fauci's and the rest. Public health professionals, they would know about which outbreak is going to be serious, how many cases are there going to be next week across the border from this outbreak, etc. So we actually ran this experiment with Johns Hopkins before COVID, right? So the year before COVID in 2019.
Just a hypothetical.
No. We ran it with literally hundreds of public health experts recruited by Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. So, the most serious, these are the guys who do the COVID dashboards, right?
Okay.
We actually ran this crowd forecasting experiment using these hundreds of public health experts on 15 months, before COVID and during COVID, on 19 different kinds of viruses all around the world, is this outbreak going to be serious? How many cases are we going to see? When, etc. So the same kinds of questions that you'd be asking about COVID that everybody's been thinking about since then. Individually, we look at the quality of those forecasts from these public health experts. Individually, they are no better than the dart-throwing chimp, no better than random guess. Some of them do a little bit better. A lot of them do a lot worse by trying to be better than the monkey, right? But 90% are going to be monkey level, even though these are experts. Why is it? Is it because they are dumb? No, they are experts. It's because the problems are just very difficult to forecast, right? And nobody has all the knowledge they would need to have a perfect model of what's going on. And most of them have shitty data that doesn't enable them to do anything really better than a random guess. But if you take all these guys who are wrong, all these chimps, you put them together into an average forecast of everybody, it does better than 99% of all the individuals, simply taking the average. And if you take, just a simple few transformations, or statistical transformations, looking at who tends to do better predictions than others, etc., and you do a weighted average instead of a simple average, then you beat everybody hands down.
By giving credit to people who were right more often in the past.
Exactly, yeah.
We did this experiment when I was in grad school. We took an exam. It was a 50-question exam. We took it individually. And then we broke into groups of 4 and took the same test again as groups of 4. And the results were staggering. I mean, nobody scored 100% on the test by themselves. Not one person. Mm-hmm. And several teams scored 100% after doing it together. And every single team scored better as a team than all the individuals did on their team, respectively.
Absolutely.
It was really mind-blowing to see
Chad,
that
even
happen.
after seeing that, you still don't believe it.
I know. This is the struggle.
Yeah.
Steve, I think you heard earlier that I am not one Chad, but many Chads. And
that's right.
One
Which
Chad
Chad
does
am I
believe
talking
it,
to?
and another Chad doesn't.
Yeah. There's something called the wisdom of fools, right?
Yeah.
So we know this whether it's doing sports forecasting or geopolitical forecasting or any other kind of trying to guess what's going to happen or what's the right answer. You take all the people who score worse than the median score, for example. So the bottom half, you put them together and then you easily reach into the top percentiles.
That's amazing. The wisdom of fools. Well, here we are on the podcast.
Putting the two Chads together, to get a better Chad. Right?
I saw that the Google CEO is trying to use the wisdom of crowds. I don't know if you read that a couple of weeks ago. So, he kind of feels like coming out of COVID, maybe the company is getting stuck a little bit, and he's trying to maybe pull the people who work at Google to figure out, like, how can we make this better? And I'm left wondering why more companies don't do that. Like, why is that a novel idea that we should just ask everyone in the company, what should we work on?
Well, because companies have been built historically on this hierarchical model, authoritarian model, not a democratic model, except at the board level where public companies, you have this sort of democracy going on a little bit. And that's a natural model to operate with. It's the model that we inherited from thousands of years of human experience, whether it be from kings or generals or now CEOs, right? So you need to lead a lot of people into doing something significant. You need to organize it in a modular, hierarchical way. And anything in nature is actually organized in this way. Anything that really works, that's sophisticated in nature, is going to have some kind of a hierarchical organization to it, including your own brain. It doesn't mean that you cannot have flow of information that goes as much bottom up than top down, right? The mistake was to think that hierarchy means top down. And what the Google CEO, I guess, is trying to do now is trying to organize a flow of information as much from the bottom up than from the top down, so that it flows within the architecture that's given by the hierarchy.
Let's transition and talk about your company, Hypermind, that you're the managing director of, because this is kind of what your company does, right? Tell us about that company and the software you've created and what it actually does for customers.
Right. So what Hypermind does is we organize what we call super collective intelligence, which is collective intelligence at the scale of a large organization or the web itself, not just 3 people in the room.
Is there a cutoff? Like it needs to be 100 people, or like where do you start?
Actually, what's interesting with collective intelligence is that you get most of the benefits at the beginning. As soon as you start asking either the chat of the next morning or the chat that's next to you today, what did he think about the problem, then it's like diminishing returns. You get the most from the beginning, and then you get less and less as you include more people. But it's a long tail thing, right? So if you have access to a very long tail, then you can make super significant improvements with that. The example is when you try to guess the weight of an animal. What we observe is that if you take 10 guesses, you average 10 guesses, you do basically 3 times better than a single guess on average. And then to do another 3-fold improvement, you need 100 guesses to do better than 10. So what that means, you get the most of collective intelligence right at the beginning, right, with the first 2, 3, 4 people. But if you have access to everybody in the organization, everybody at Google, everybody in America, so hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, then you have these super long tails that you can really exploit to great benefit. So what we do is Hypermind is we have these platforms, digital platforms on the web that enable this very large-scale collaboration to either make predictions together or to have ideas like, how can we make Google better?
Yeah, what product should we work on?
Exactly. So you have this sort of brainstorm of ideas, and then you have this prioritization, again, through some kind of betting or forecasting in order to know what are the ideas that are likely better than the others.
What are the mechanics of the prioritization process? Like, how does that actually work if I'm an employee doing this?
So the first thing you'd have to do is either give your ideas to solve the problem that's been given to you, look at the ideas that other people have been given, etc. Then we eventually, in the second phase, list all the ideas that have been provided and give people tokens, chips, red chips and green chips. So the green chips you use to bet on which ideas are going to lead to the better outcomes, and the red chips you bet on the ideas that will lead to the wrong outcomes. So sometimes you don't know because the outcomes may be too far into the future. So we use proxy outcomes like, is the management going to choose this idea for implementation, or is the management not going to choose these ideas? So every bet that you make with your red and green chips is going to bring you points.
So it's not about what the good idea is, it's about whether management will like it.
Well, if you think your management is unable to make a decent choice, you should not be working for that company. Somebody who has all the constraints in mind, which is the top guys or gals, are going to be able to make a decent choice informed by the priorities expressed by the crowd. What the process does, which is really nice, is it puts everybody at the bottom in the top role. If I was the manager of the company, which is the decision that I would make for the collective, which is the company? So it's very reassuring for the top person, for the top manager, the top decision maker, to think that everybody is trying to be in his place or her place. Because that's reassuring. It's like, they're not going to just give me stupid ideas that are not implementable in my role, right? Everybody is trying to put their feet into my shoes to make that decision. So I get informed, useful data from these guys. And for those people at the bottom who try to put themselves in the manager's shoes, or decision maker's shoes, it's a valuable experience and it makes them feel better about themselves. If I was the top boss, what would I do? So you sort of think about the world differently, and everybody gets good data out of it.
How do you deal with, we know in these large organizations, sometimes middle and upper managers, they have their little kingdoms and they don't want something that would maybe jeopardize their kingdom and help someone else maybe. How do you, does that play into it at all?
Yeah, it's actually the big hurdle that we need to face when we do collective intelligence, because everybody at the bottom is for it. Everybody at the top is for it as well. And then you have people in the middle who would like to control the information. We worked for a company once, a big automaker in the US, to do sales forecasting based on collective intelligence of the company. So we basically organized contests to make predictions about sales. And the VP of sales quickly realized that it was not a good idea for these sales predictions to be publicly available because he wanted to control what his boss was going to hear. And he wanted to be the one bringing the message to the boss and control the information flow. And so he actually paid us to get out. And then the company went bankrupt 6 months later.
Wow.
So you can imagine which one it was.
Well, that's a very dysfunctional corporate structure. Yeah.
We only work for dysfunctional companies in a way, because if a company has like super good forecasting abilities, it doesn't need us. And if a company has super dysfunctional forecasting abilities like this automaker had, then it doesn't really need us or doesn't want us, because even if we can give it good predictions, good forecast, it has learned to operate without them at all, right? So they learn to act without predictions.
Steve, you don't think it's dysfunctional for a VP to hide information from upper management?
I think it is dysfunctional, but I don't know that it's necessarily a sign of like the whole organization is broken. Let me put it that way. What Emile is saying is the people in the middle have something to lose, and that fear, that feeling overrides whatever quote unquote logic we would think that they would come up with, which is like, hey, I want better forecasting. There's this basically proven way to do it, but I don't want to do it because forecasting is a big part of my job. And if I outsource that to the crowd, I'm no longer valuable. Worst fears realized, right? Like I'm no longer valuable at my job. So I'm going to do everything I can to protect that value. And if that means, hiding this, then that's what I'm going to do. So yes, it's dysfunctional, but I also think it's part of human psychology and just like the self-preservation aspect.
Absolutely. So that's a hurdle that we face. But the solution is pretty simple. It's just making sure that whoever is in this role doesn't feel threatened, because he would actually own the results, and it would help him or her be smarter.
Yeah.
Right. But how do you make them not afraid that like their job could just be replaced by, just polls of employees or whatever?
We're betting as a society that technology gets rid of the tedious jobs and enables us to create new jobs that are more satisfying and fulfilling.
But I'm just wondering if this technology in particular will lead to less middle management, because you just, maybe we don't need them as much to make these decisions.
Well, you still need people to organize the collective intelligence. It's not the same type of management role, but it's still a management role. You manage a community instead of managing, the way you used to before.
It does change the nature of management.
So it becomes more of a leadership thing than a sheer information control thing, right?
Yeah, Emile, after reading your book, I got so many ideas for how I would approach my next leadership job, and like getting the intelligence of that collective crowd surfaced. And it made me feel like all my efforts up till now have been very amateur, which is fine, because like it was very informative. So in my next role after my sabbatical, I'm going to try some of these techniques and maybe even employer services at Hypermind. But I just thought it was very fascinating, because I do see it as a leadership thing. Like what Chad's saying is, if I'm a sales leader and I'm trying to forecast, it's one of the hardest jobs to do, because you're basically the machine now that's trying to do all this algorithmic stuff in your head. Eventually, I think most sales leaders I've worked with do get somewhat accurate, but it could be made more accurate by the wisdom of the crowds. And I think if we can get over that fear and use it as a data informer rather than something that I fear is going to replace me, then, once that psychology changes, I think adoption will start to grow. I think that's the biggest issue I see with machine learning in general right now, at least in the space of observability and with programmers, is there's a lot of fear that it's going to replace my job. And I think that's hurting adoption. And I think the narrative has to change. It's going to augment your job, not replace it. Just like if I were to get like a hearing aid, it's not going to replace my ear. It augments my hearing. But so many people think it's just going to replace me that they don't want to even invest, I think. Fear of the unknown, maybe.
Using the crowd to change the way that you do your job. For example, take forecasting. Rather than just doing the computations yourself, what you're doing is your job becomes asking the right questions, because the crowd will only be able to answer the questions that you ask. And just choosing the right questions is already such an important job. Any scientist will tell you asking the right question is 80% of what science is about, right? And then the rest is just legwork. As a manager of collective intelligence, your job is to ask the right questions and then let them do the computation.
So you had an interesting customer. Well, first of all, who's the customer really? Who's buying your product and your services? Is it the CEO who's part of a company, or?
It's the decision makers.
And who is the decision maker usually in this case?
In a large company, it could be anyone, as long as you have some kind of business unit that you're directing that has enough people that you think you can call upon using these platforms. If you're only leading a team of 6 people, you don't need a platform.
And just ask them in a room.
But if you have dozens and they are distributed in many different places or in different departments or they don't work at the same time, then you need these technologies to be able to query them at scale asynchronously.
And in a way which makes it anonymous so that they're not afraid to tell you their real true thoughts.
Well, sometimes anonymity helps and sometimes anonymity doesn't help. For example, on social networks, you can see that anonymity sort of pollutes the discourse more than it helps the discourse. But when you're trying to protect speech that could be penalized because it doesn't go in the direction that is thought to be correct by the managers or decision makers, then obviously anonymity helps a lot.
And so you had some sort of use case that you did with a customer in France, right? Well, tell us about that.
So we have this really interesting customer in France, which is the electric utility. They run a huge number of power plants, of nuclear power plants.
Yeah, most electricity in France is nuclear, right?
I think it used to be 70%. Recent political decisions have tried to bring that down.
Bummer. Should be 90% or 100%.
Well, yes, but 2 years ago, it seemed a good idea to close nuclear plants. Like in Germany, after Fukushima, they closed most nuclear plants and committed to actually have all of them closed.
Anyway, we're off the topic here.
We're completely off topic.
So you're working with the nuclear power plants.
So the point is, it's a very sophisticated, very engineering-heavy, really smart bunch of people, from the best schools in France. That's where you would go, right? And it's a huge organization. And we do a lot of work with them because they had this wonderful idea of creating a collective intelligence department. And it's the only company I know in the world that has a collective intelligence department, just like you have a marketing department or R&D department.
Before working with you even, they came to this on their own.
A year before, yeah. So it's quite recent still. It's like maybe 2-3 years ago. And their job is to organize the collective intelligence of the company whenever a decision maker, manager at any level wants to do a query of the crowd for helping to make a decision. That's where they would go. They would go to these guys and they would master the right ways of doing it. And they would know which tools to use, etc., including the Hypermind tools.
Okay.
So they would know how to deploy them, etc. So we do a lot of different work with them. It's like an inside consulting company that's dedicated to collective intelligence at the service of every manager in the company. And so we do a lot of ideation and prioritization to solve problems. For example, in France, they're trying to come up with a new technology for a new kind of nuclear power plant. And they've been trying to do that for many, many years. And it's many, many years over budget. And it's still not resolved. And so one of the problems that they ask us to intervene on is how do we get these hundreds of people on site trying to build this plant, this new kind of plant? How do we get them to actually finish it? Because now it's become a big problem. It should have been finished like 6 or 7 years ago when they're still not working together well enough. So we actually came in with the platform and say, everybody provide your ideas on how we can make the process of working together better to finish the plant next year. And then everybody bet on which were the best ideas to get to the goal of finishing the plant. And that was a huge success because it actually gives the management a sort of Bible of everybody's positioning, what different people from all the different jobs that are involved on the ground, what do all these different groups think with respect to each other, where are they aligned, and where do they totally diverge, and what is important to each, and therefore what can we negotiate in order to get it done together.
Did you do the negative betting there too? I was really fascinated by this idea of negative betting, so I never thought about before.
It's very important. Yeah. Betting on the bad ideas is actually more important than betting on the good ones.
Betting against the bad ideas, I should say, yeah.
So it's actually more important because the theory, and that's something that's been discovered by MIT researcher Mark Klein, a colleague of mine in the School of Collective Intelligence in Morocco. And he actually compared the efficacy of having only negative bets or only positive bets.
Oh, okay.
Or actually doing ratings of each idea, right? So in one condition, you had people who had only a few tokens or a few chips they could bet for or they could bet against. And then in another, they had to rate every idea. And what he found is that the negative bets were much more informative. They would surface the ideas that had no great defect much more efficiently than the positive bets would. Why is that? Because each of us is a specialist in one dimension that is important to rating an idea. So an idea for a product, for example, needs to be commercially viable. It needs to be technically viable. It needs to be marketing viable, etc. It needs to be viable in many different domains, right? Many different dimensions. And none of us is marketing genius and engineering genius and sales genius at the same time. So if an idea looks good to the engineer, maybe it has a huge marketing defect. Or if an idea looks great to the sales guy, maybe it has a big engineering defect that it actually cannot be built, whatever, right? So the negative bets are much more informed. The negative opinions are more informed than the positive opinion, which needs to be good on all dimensions. The negative one just needs to say, no, this is not going to fly in this dimension that I know about. These types of ratings are much more efficient in terms of outcome and also much faster to do as well.
So if you just did negative betting, you'd have a better result than if you just did positive betting.
Right.
And if you do them together, how much better is the result?
Well, when we do it together, not only is it more politically palatable, the managers inside companies typically don't want us to use negative betting at all, right? They say, oh, it puts bad vibes. But we tell them, it's very important if you want to filter out the bad stuff, the fake good ideas. It's very important that you include the negative betting. Not only that, but it gives us statistically much cleaner results and visually much more informative results. So we always include both.
So what was the outcome of this process for the utility in France?
Well, they get rid of a lot of stupid ideas, including those from the management themselves. So what it does do is it helps the management validate some of the good ideas that they had. It helps them eliminate the wrong good ideas or those ideas that were not really good, could have looked good, but were eliminated by the crowd. And it also gives them a lot of the crowd creativity for thinking about other ideas they did not have. So you get the benefit of the creativity of the crowd as well as the validation or the elimination of stuff that you thought about.
Man, I just feel like this is something every company should be doing all the time. I've worked, how many product companies have I worked at, Steve? I don't know, 7, 8, whatever it is. And we would have calls with product management and they would ask us our opinions, but there was never like the bottoms up, the company's going to vote on what we work on, right? Have you ever seen that, Steve?
Yeah, I see it all the time with GitHub.
Yes, but product managers say, well, yeah, GitHub, that's like one signal that we take in.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They don't ask the whole company to vote on features.
One of the ways I've seen it work is through these hackathons, right? Like last company I worked at did hackathons about every 6 months, 3 to 6 months. And that was a way to crowdsource the best ideas based on what everyone knew was happening on the ground. And it wasn't limited to just engineering, right? Like anyone could participate. Marketing people would get involved so that they could help with the presentation to present the idea. There was a lot of good collaboration that came out of it. And there was a lot of good ideas that got surfaced out of that actually became product features or are on the roadmap now. So I think hackathons, while they don't do things like negative betting, which is, again, like kind of this thing that I'll never think about the same again.
Yeah.
It does help, I think. And Emile, you made this comment in the book about like when you get together, collective intelligence is not about the combined IQ, it's about the combined EQ or emotional quotient or emotional intelligence, which I thought was really interesting. So it's almost like this group of people that get together can be smarter, not because their IQs are higher, but because they're just, if they can communicate well and reach shared understanding quickly, then they'll likely produce better results than a bunch of really smart people together in the same group that don't communicate well.
Yeah, you see that in sports all the time, right? You have these all-star teams of superstars that don't work together effectively, and then the team just doesn't deliver. Whereas you have these like Moneyball type teams that are, statistically super well matched, that will give you high performance. So it's the same idea. Yeah.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. Steve and I were literally just talking about Moneyball on, I think, Monday night. And there's a scene in Moneyball where – have you seen the movie?
Yeah.
Okay. There's a scene where Brad Pitt is sitting around the table with all of the scouts for the Oakland A's. And they're basically saying, well, we got to go with this guy. We don't want this guy because his legs are shot, or, this guy has, he doesn't have a pretty girlfriend, which means he doesn't have good confidence, which means he's not going to hit well. They're basically using all these things that they've learned over the last 40 years for how they pick a good athlete. And he was distilling it down to a single number. I don't care anything about your legs, you're this, you're that, you're that. What's your on-base percentage? That's it. That's the only thing I care about. And it's almost like, I don't need any of you scouts out here. Your job is irrelevant because all I care about is this one number, and your job can just go away for all I care. I mean, that's kind of why I keep poking at this idea that this technology will obviate certain jobs. Because when we do distill things down like this, it can do that.
Yeah, but then it creates another job, which is Brad Pitt's job, which is to figure out, how to create a team that is going to function well together.
Right, but he could get rid of 12 scouts that were in the room. If all he cares about is on-base percentage, he can look that up in a computer.
Couldn't that have experiment been more well-informed, or that prediction been more well-informed by the 12 scouts and their collective intelligence used in the right way?
Probably the key word is used in the right way. Because if the scouts are focused on the merits of the individual only, then they are not focused on the right problem, which is how does this individual contribute to the team.
Well, we have new statistics now. Like in basketball, you'll look at a statistic like how much does the team score when this guy's on the court versus not on the court, right? And what's his contribution, even if he's not the one scoring? They can measure that now, yeah.
Right. So that's collective intelligence science right there. How do you build a team from the interactions of the individual? And it's very hard for me to change your IQ, Steve. The only way you can change your IQ is by maybe including some chips, but you can't do that yet, right? Or
yeah,
sign me up.
The Johnny Mnemonic install.
Yeah,
I need the IQ.
I need 40 more megabytes.
Right, so you can't do that. But if you have a team of people, you can change the IQ of the team by, ultimately maybe removing everybody on the team, just including other people instead. But you can pick and choose, to remove one person that doesn't work well with the rest of the team. The asshole principle. My brother always tells me, you have one asshole on the team, and then the whole team becomes terrible to work with, right? Yeah. So you can certainly improve the IQ of the group by changing the properties or switching the individuals around. Right? So that's the science of collective intelligence right there. How do you build a better team, whether it's 6 people in the room or whether it's hundreds of people or thousands of people together on the platform?
Well, Steve, do you have any more questions about the company?
I was just going to ask one thing. And Emile, you'll probably plug this later, but you have on your website on Hypermind, you have the masterclass page where people can go through and watch your YouTube videos. And then at the end, you can actually join one of the prediction games. And I'm just curious to hear you kind of describe that. So on your website, there's a button that says predict now, and it takes you to another page. What is the point of having that on the site? What are you guys trying to do?
So we actually have 3 products, right? We have a platform that we sell, for example, to the electric company or others in the US that enables the creation and operation of prediction contests. And it could be about anything you care about, right? It could be about your sales numbers, your ability to deliver a project, whatever. So that's a sort of prediction platform, prediction contest platform. Then we have another platform for the ideation, prioritization stuff that we talked about with the negative bets. And then we have a third product, which is kind of weird, which is actually not a platform, but it's a panel. So we sell to you, just like Amazon would sell you this panel of mechanical turkers. We sell to you this panel of vetted champion forecasters that are excellent at making forecasts about just about anything that is of interest to them.
Are they experts in certain areas only, or it just could be anything?
They are excellent forecasters because they have the right way of thinking about the future. So the result of experiments we've conducted with the US government and the intelligence agencies, and that was managed by the University of Pennsylvania with huge grants from IARPA, You know IARPA. You know DARPA?
DARPA.
Okay, so IARPA is the same as DARPA, except it's for the intelligence agency.
Oh, okay.
Instead of defense, it's intelligence
ARPA, okay.
research itself.
Okay.
So they finance a lot of really far-thinking research on how to, anything that could be of help to better intelligence agencies, better CIA, right? And one of the things they did is they founded this research on crowd forecasting, using lots of people like you and me, readers of magazines, not experts on geopolitics, and giving them lots of questions from the CIA about, what might happen at the other end of the world, between China and Taiwan, for example, and having people make this probability forecast. And they found that not only can the crowd do pretty good forecast, even though they only have access to Google and newspapers and not satellite imagery, not whatever, right? They can do very good, but there are also among us, 2% among us, can be called super forecasters in the sense that they are really excellent at this forecasting stuff, and they are consistently excellent. So it's not a matter of chance, it's really a matter of skill. And part of the masterclass is, talking about these guys and the way that they think about the future. So making predictions is really a matter not of being an expert in a particular domain, but thinking about the future in the right way. It's how you think that matters. And the most important thing about how you think is what we call active open-minded thinking in psychology, which is basically being open to hearing people telling you you're full of shit and you don't know anything, which most of us don't like, right? That's why we like those Facebook bubbles and stuff, right? So being open to contradiction, not only being open to it, but actively seeking people who are going to tell you you have the whole thing wrong. You don't have the right data. You don't think about this data in the right way. You should really view the problem from a totally different angle, etc. And those people are really good forecasters. They have this natural ability to actually enjoy meeting people who are going to tell them they're wrong.
They like the conflict.
Right. So once you know that, you have the secret for how to become a smarter person, is seeking people who are thinking differently about the world than you do, and being able to integrate that, not necessarily agree with it, but at least considering those different opinions before you come up with your own. And then the next day starting over and doing it again. Because the next day the world may have changed and you may need to change your mind about it. Right? So the great forecasters are those people. And you can learn those tricks, but obviously just like math, some people are just naturally better at it. But you can still learn to try to do it better, just like we all learn math. Right? So what we provide with Hypermind is this panel of such people that can be applied, those brain power that can be applied to any forecasting problem that you want to submit to it. So obviously it's not going to be like super confidential stuff about your company, but it could be things in the environment of your company, in the business environment, political environment, whatever, that is important for you to consider before you make a decision.
Sort of wrapping things up here, where is all this going? Like, what's the forefront of the field of collective intelligence? Is there research that's going? What are the people working on now?
Yeah, so what's really interesting is we're experiencing the same problem and the same research issues that AI is experiencing. So it's like these two forms of intelligence are sort of growing side by side and sometimes really together, because a lot of AI is actually collective intelligence repackaged. So one problem that we all face is explanation. So we can come up with great predictions for, the probability that the Democrats are going to win the House. But what we don't have available so easily is the explanation for that probability.
Right. We talk about explainability in AI on a previous episode. Yeah.
Explainability. So it's the same problem. So the great research now in AI is how do you explain what the network is telling you?
Right.
And we have the same problem. How do we explain what the crowd is telling us? And so a lot of what we do now is research in this side of things. How do we find the process for asking people to give us bits of explanations? Because nobody has a complete explanation for anything. They have bits of explanations, and how do you combine those into a story that makes sense?
But sometimes it's just people's feelings. I guess that's the explanation sometimes. They just feel a certain way. It's not always like, oh, I sat and thought about it and this is why.
I know.
Right?
So if you ask people to give a full rationale for their prediction, that's sort of unfair because we are tapping into a lot of what they know unconsciously. A lot of implicit knowledge is being tapped into, that gut brain you were talking about, right? You have a lot of stuff that you've internalized. You don't even know how you know anymore. But we're trying to tap into that, right? All this just like a neural network, it has learned a lot of stuff, and then you don't know any specific, data that went into it anymore. So when you ask people to give you a full rationale, it's not going to work. But if you ask people, what did you consider? Which elements did you consider into your thinking? You don't have to lay them out into a logical sequence. Just tell me, what you considered, what you looked at. Which article did you read, etc. And then we can put that all together into something that's informative, even though it may not be a completely logical, coherent explanation. It can give you the pros, it can give you the cons, it can give you something that helps you understand where that prediction comes from.
So do you need to add some of that to these products at Hypermind? Is that?
We're currently doing that. It's very important because the decision makers really require that. The problem with the human brain is it doesn't like probabilities. It likes stories.
Right.
A good story will trump a good probability anytime, right? And that's actually a bad thing. But we need to work with it. So we need to come up with stories that stick with the correct probabilities.
Well, I got to say that, the whole time I was reading your book, I kept thinking about politics and countries and how countries are governed and why don't we have more direct democracy and all this. And then I get to the final chapter and that's kind of what you address. And I was so happy to see that you went there. You really ended the book kind of with a bang and basically making the argument that we should have a more direct democracy than the representative republics that we have now, which I strongly agree with. I don't understand why, at least on big ticket items, maybe not on some minutia of this particular, zoning variance or something. But like if New York City is going to say we're going to spend $5 billion, should we spend it on giving teachers more money or should we spend it on building an extension to a subway line? Why don't we get to vote on that stuff? It's our money. I think it would be better and it would deal with a lot of the corruption that is involved in making the decisions would just go away.
Yeah. But you would need to be smarter than that still. You need to decouple the goals, which are based on our preferences. What kind of city do we want to be? And the ways to get there. Typically, today, we are confusing that by asking people to vote on the means rather than to vote on the goals. So let's take one of your examples. What was it?
Should we give teachers more money or should we extend a subway line into a new neighborhood?
So why would you do either? What's the goal in each case, right? So you can vote for deciding what kind of city you want to be. Do you want to be a city where everybody moves really fast? Or do you want to be a city where everybody stays in place but is more educated? So that's the goal. So, we vote on that and then we make a decision. We want to be that type of city. Now the question becomes, what's the best way to get there? Is it to invest in the subway or is it to invest in education? And then we can use those prediction markets, those crowd forecasting platforms to give you the probabilities for achieving the goal using different means. If I invest in the subway, what's the probability that I become the type of city I want to be? If I invest in education, is it a higher or lower probability than if I invest in the subway for reaching my goal? And so you decouple the vote for choosing who we want to be and the predictions for deciding what's the best way to get there. Because the predictions are based on reality, whereas the goals are based on preference, which is totally subjective. And values and preferences don't have to connect with reality. They just are.
Yeah, that's fair.
Right?
Yeah.
They just are.
Yeah.
But then once you decide these are the values we want to implement, what's the best way to get there? And one of the values I think we share is that democracy is important. And what I was trying to say at the end of the book is that democracy has been declining for the last 20 years, certainly for the last 10 years around the world. It's been declining in the most democratic countries like France or the US. Hungary, used to be a democracy. a few years ago. Now it's becoming more and more autocratic. Poland, same thing. Arab Spring, down the drain, etc. So everywhere, rise of autocracy enabled in many places by AI.
And the surveillance state.
Authoritarian ruler loves AI. Right? AI is an enabler of authoritarianism. Whereas collective intelligence is something they will never touch. So it's sort of a secret weapon for democracies.
Well, let me read the final paragraph from your book because I want to end on that. I think it's so powerful, if that's okay.
Please.
I don't want to impair any of your sales, but I feel like you've sort of buried the lead of the book. So I'm going to read this here. However, in the epic fight against new dictatorships, democracies could yield a powerful and exclusive weapon that the enemy will never dare to use: super collective intelligence made possible by the very same digital technology. This is the weapon of choice that could enable our democracies to overcome thanks to superior intelligence. Our leaders must be more willing to think together with citizens. The fate of humanity depends on it. I literally just got goosebumps when I read that last line.
Cool.
Emile, so powerful, this idea. And I can tell that this is your major work that you're putting into the world is not for how to make companies make more money, but you want to change democracies and make them stronger, and that's so powerful. I think your book is as good as and as important, really, for people to read as some of the other well-known books in this area. Tipping Point, Thinking Fast and Slow, Black Swan, all of these books, which are very, very popular. I hope your book reaches that level of popularity because I do think it will change the world if it does. And I want to thank you for coming on the show today. This has been one of the best 2-hour interviews I've ever had in my entire life.
Thanks, me too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
This book is one of those ones that, to Chad's point, it changed how I think almost instantly. It made me feel super dumb, which is good because it challenges me to learn more about this. And I laughed when I read all your references at the end of the book because I'm like, that's a lot of research I got to go do.
When the book came out in France, it was immediately shelved into the self-help part of the bookstore. And I called the editor. I said, what? I'm not going to say the profanity on your show, but...
You can. You can swear. It's the fucking internet.
WTF. Yeah, say it in French. It'll be way better.
Yeah, say it in French.
So I said, there's something wrong here. It's a book about the collective. What's it doing in self-help, And she told me, well, don't worry, that's the only place where books actually sell. I was like, okay, but then, then I started making...
That's so funny.
Then I started making conferences and keynotes, etc., about the book, and my problem became not to have people read the book, but what can I tell them that they would at the end of 60 minutes come away with that would be important? What are the key learnings that I want people to take away that would be important for them after having listened to me for an hour? And I realized that really this book on collective intelligence is about how to make everyone smarter.
Absolutely.
It's about how to make me smarter. And, I think, Steve, you said, I'm going to try some of these things, right? You're going to try them on you, right? And you and your team. So it's not about sacrificing yourself to the collective. It's really about how can I become smarter by using the collective around me, by using my networks, the brains that are surrounding me that I can borrow. And really collective intelligence is about borrowing. I love that word, borrowing other people's brains around you to become a smarter person yourself. So it is really a self-help book.
It should be right next to the book on how to kill your ego because that will be the death of this too, right?
Okay. We're going to do a ketamine trip and then learn about the collective intelligence. All right. We got to wrap it up. Hey, everybody, I hope you like this episode. If you do, share it on LinkedIn, share it on Facebook, share it on Twitter, and get the word out because this book is really, really amazing, and you should all buy it when it comes out and read it because it will change your life.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. See you in the next episode.